What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Unknown 9 Awakening. A relatively short and linear action-adventure featuring the setting of Unknown 9, which is what drew me to it as I was a little curious about what it was. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviews on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a video linked below that goes over everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, in the case of Unknown 9, it is important that I tell you I have done a sponsored video for this previously, though of course that video was not a review, and no review of mine would ever be sponsored in any way. But with that said, let's actually dive into this and talk about this one. So as I mentioned, what drew me to this the most was the Unknown 9 universe, because I hadn't heard about it when this game was initially announced, so I did some digging and was curious about what it entailed. And we'll of course talk about that over the course of this review, but while I would say that is the primary point of interest for this one, the game does run into a host of other issues. Minor technical problems, to be sure, that make it feel like a decidedly janky experience, which I would say is certainly juxtaposed against the game's price point of $50, which is a lot for a game like this, because while it serves as a good primer to that universe, and even has some fun combat moments, for the most part there's just not enough game here to justify that price tag. So let's get into it. Starting, of course, with the technical side of things. So as I mentioned, this is a pretty janky game. As you can see, some of the animations certainly look a little weird. Enemies' reactions to being hit by your character don't always seem to make a lot of sense. You're probably going to see the cursor on screen throughout much of this video because for whatever reason that is just how that looked. Couldn't ever get that to go away even with messing around with settings. And while the game didn't crash or anything for me, perusal through Steam reviews from the relatively few reviews that there are will tell you about things such as a couple of crashes and a few glitchy animations like getting stuck on individual bits of terrain as an example. So while it's certainly not the worst I've ever seen by any means, it's definitely not in like a fantastic place on the technical side of things either. Now, as you move to start the game, there are 4 different difficulty modes, story through awakened, pretty much what you would expect here. Basically, enemies get harder as you move up the difficulty tiers, but as we'll talk about during the combat section, once you get a few specific perks, let's call them, the game becomes very, very easy, if a little bursty. Now, from there, let's talk about the story setup and my thoughts on it. So, Unknown 9 Awakening puts us in the role of Haruna, who starts the game under the tutelage of her mentor Reika. Reika and Haruna are able to manipulate what they call AM, which is energy from a place called the Fold. This allows them to perform what are effectively the feats of like a Jedi or just any Force user from Star Wars basically. They can push and pull people, shroud themselves as a stealth mechanic, cause little distractions, stun enemies with this, crush walls, etc. The list goes on. Our mentor, Reika, is chasing down one of her former students known as Vincent, who seems to be making a grab for power via the Leap Year Society that they were previously both a part of, which is all connected to the cycles, the Saheen, and the Unknown 9. The gist of it is the world happens in cycles. Every so often it gets wiped out, so things can be born anew. However, a past civilization known as the Saheen did not want this, obviously, and shielded 9 of their members from death, creating the Unknown 9, who have since made it their mission to attempt to stop these cycles with, no success, as you might imagine. So that's kind of the background of what's going on in the story, with Vincent making this grab for power, and you have to try to figure out what's going on. Now, the thing is, the game is pretty short. The story took me about 10 hours, and then I spent about another 10 hours collecting collectibles, because with this game not exactly getting a lot of love, you couldn't really find any guides for it. But with that in mind, the game is chapter-based for the most part, and while you're moving through it, it won't actually stop and show you those chapters or anything. You can replay the ones you have previously done from the main menu, which does track your progress with things like the collectibles, so you can get them that way. But otherwise, it's a linear jaunt through a relatively short game, following up on those basic leads. Now, my thoughts on that story, though, are that it is kind of trying too hard, if that makes sense. The game is constantly throwing like little plot twists at you, and for a game that only runs for 10 hours, there is a lot going on here. but because they keep constantly shifting up what you're doing and cutting from scene to scene, sometimes it can be a little hard to keep up with, despite how short it is. And while if you are interested in this universe, some of this is genuinely interesting, like when you are traversing the fold and getting to the bottom of some cosmic mysteries, let's say, it basically just feels like sometimes the game forgets it can show you things rather than simply tell you about all of them. Though ironically, that kind of is what makes it a good primer for this universe, if that is of interest to you. Now from there, let's talk progression systems. Progression systems for this game are very basic. It basically comes down to your perk points and skill trees on top of finding runes. Much more common though, as we move through the game's chapters, we will find Gnosis points. These will give us skill points to spend on our various abilities on our 3 different skill trees, focusing on melee combat, your powers, or the just general stealth gameplay. So, of course, as you pick up more Gnosis points and spend them on these abilities, you get better and better. Though I would say stealth and powers are the main way to go, especially stealth, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in the combat section. Now, the other part of progression are the runes. Haruna is able to peek into the fold to see that sort of parallel universe side of things, and sometimes this will reveal things in the environment, such as runes. There are 2 different types of runes. One increases your max health, the other increases your max AM, or your power for your abilities that replenishes. And that's pretty much it for progression systems, which brings us to the gameplay and world sections. So as I mentioned, this is a chapter-based game. Each chapter sees you potentially collecting a whole bunch of different story stuff, but also performing some light platforming and puzzle solving as you move to grapple with the game's main enemies, the Ascendants, or Vincent's team of people that he's leading in his nefarious endeavors. Now, in between some of these chapters, you will occasionally find yourself on the Morning Star, a giant airship you managed to get your hands on, and that's going to see you doing some light globe-trotting to the game's various locales across the world. And I will say there is a decent amount of variety there. It was interesting to actually see some of the places the game has to show you, especially with the mysterious ruins and an almost sort of Indiana Jones vibe, at least to me. But that's pretty much all there is, because in between all of that, you basically get into combat arenas where you have to take out enemies, either by stealth or full-on assault, based on, I would say, largely what perks you've been upgrading. Which brings us to the game's combat system. So, combat in this game is interesting, because it's certainly a little janky, but it does absolutely have its fun moments. Now, for the most part, you're simply going to unlock skills as you make a little bit of story progression and then use the ones you prefer the most and the approach you like to defeating all the enemies in your vicinity. Such as shrouding yourself, of course, to take down enemies stealthily, and with an upgrade you can take down even the elite enemies that are normally immune to this and go for that perfect stealth run. Or you can put your powers to use, setting up more elaborate kills, such as setting off environmental hazards, pushing enemies off of ledges, using your abilities to stun them and then follow up with a big attack, capitalizing upon that stun. So you've got a few options there. Now, right away, with how short the game is, it's probably unsurprising. There's not a lot of enemy variety, a lot of repetitious enemies. There's only I would say 4 or 5 different kinds really, though some of them are upgraded versions of the other ones. But the main things I want to mention are that stealth is extremely overpowered. So you get this ability called Shroud that keeps you invisible based on how much of your AM that you have. Now normally when you attack an enemy, this fades even with the elite takedown option. But if you couple that with Tenacious Shroud, which keeps you shrouded even after you kill an enemy, you can wipe out whole encampments without ever being seen, and honestly without much challenge at all, making the game a cakewalk. But another really cool power, and honestly perhaps my favorite bit of this game, is a possession ability. So Haruna possesses the ability to possess other people. They call this stepping. Now, as the game progresses, you can start chaining these together with multiple possessions back to back based on the number of tokens you have specifically to do this, up to a maximum of 3 possessions. And then while you are possessing those enemies, you can set them up to use one of their main abilities in order to, of course, damage other enemies ideally, or, say position them more favorably for you. And that turned out to actually be a lot of fun. I enjoyed setting up elaborate scenarios with this in a way that kind of reminded me of Dishonored's playstyles in some regards. Other than that stuff, it's pretty much just a basic combat system. If you happen to get involved in melee, you've got a dodge ability, with an upgraded shield that you get access to. You can, of course, block things or simply parry them. And you've got a light attack, a heavy attack to break blocks, unbreak attacks which allow you to stun the enemy, etc. So a fairly standard combat system for the most part that has the occasional fun moments like that stepping possession power, which I thought was really fun. And with that, let's move on a little bit, mostly to the Steam Deck. And I would describe your experience with this on Steam Deck likely to be very average. I mean, you can play it, you can get it running, it has controller support, cloud saves, and all of that, but it also sort of just has the general problems that the main game has with a lot of those janky animations and little tiny technical quibbles. And while not being, I would say, the most graphically impressive game, the Steam Deck does seem to struggle with it a bit, trying to get it above 30 FPS in particular, which for an action-focused game isn't always the best thing in the world. So, I mean, you could play this on the Steam Deck, but the performance certainly does leave a little bit to be desired. Which brings me to my positives and negatives for this one. So, on the positive side of things, for starters, the powers and abilities are fun. I mean, honestly, those types of powers are fun in basically every game you put them in, and they do put you in a lot of positions to actually use those powers, and they do seem to have gotten that part right. And honestly, the setting is pretty interesting as well. One of the main draws to this game for me was just to learn more about this Unknown 9 universe and what that was all about, because they've established this through things like books and like a podcast even, I believe. And I was curious to learn about it. And to be fair, that setting is very interesting, even if I don't think they did the best job of explaining some of it throughout a story that, again, tends to tell you about things more than like show them to you, as you might expect from a video game. Which brings me to my negatives, primarily that the story is oftentimes a little hard to follow, frankly, and that the technical state certainly leaves a lot to be desired. Which brings me to my conclusion for this one. This game is $50 over on Steam, at least in the US and whatever that is regionally for people, but point blank, I don't think there's enough game here to really justify that price tag, especially when you start looking at the jank associated with a game like this. And while I do find the world very interesting, which was fun to learn about in this game, and I do think this game serves as a good primer for it, for $50, it's a bit of a non-starter. And because of that, I really just don't see a lot of people playing this, which honestly the game's pretty frosty reception up to this point probably makes that pretty unsurprising. However, with that in mind, I do think like the one use case for this, so to speak, would be that if you just happen to want to learn about this particular universe and you can catch this game on sale, I do think it's alright for like $20, then you might find some enjoyment in it. But for the vast majority of people, I would say this is probably going to be a don't buy or a wait for a very deep sale. So hopefully they bring that price down for people, because I do think there's an interesting world here, but there's just not enough game to justify the price tag otherwise, which is where I'm going to leave off this particular review, which I certainly hope you enjoyed. And to that end, I would be very curious to hear what you have to say about this one down in the comment section below, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.